Welcome to September's Tea of the Month video. September is always a very special month in Global Tea Hut because it means the extended edition. In lieu of a gift, we dive deeper into a topic and expand the magazine and add a whole bunch of extra pages. The first year we did this was 2014. We produced one of the largest publications on pu'er tea ever made in the English language. You can go to our website and read that for free. September 2014, tons of information on pu'er tea. And then last year, we translated the Cha Jing, the Tang Dynasty classic of tea, written by Lu Yu, with tons of annotations, hundreds of annotations, so you can read that classic text and learn about ancient tea and tea philosophy. This year, we decided to stay close to home, so we published the largest English language publication on Taiwanese oolong tea ever produced. It's amazing, jam-packed, full of tons of information, and a lot of it goes way beyond what has ever even been written about, even sometimes in Chinese. For example, we cover all the varietals of tea in Taiwan, which is a topic that's very rarely covered. In fact, some of the farmers that we were interviewing about these subjects, we asked them, how many of your customers ever ask you or know anything about the varietals that you're using? And they said almost none, literally none. It's something that farmers know a lot about, but that tea consumers, tea lovers rarely know anything about. That's something that's changing as there's more transparency in the tea market. More and more people are learning about varietals, but we've included almost every varietal and discussions of them. Of course, the history of tea, the processing of tea, the different kinds of tea, organics, and many, many other topics. And this month's tea, to top it off, is one of the most magnificent teas that we've ever sent in Global Tea Hut. It's absolutely stunning. We called it Nostalgia. Nostalgia is an amazing tea, really, really special. This is going to be an amazing month. We hope that you're enjoying Nostalgia. We've already received dozens of emails saying that this tea is really, really amazing. Can we get some? We'll talk about that a little bit later. So I'm here drinking some Nostalgia. What a wonderful tea. Really, what an amazing tea. This is one of the brightest, most valuable, rarest teas we've ever sent out and shared with you guys. A lot went into this tea, a lot of time and effort, and a lot of just good karmas that collided, and circumstances and good tea friends came together to make this beautiful, beautiful tea. There are three reasons why this tea is so stunning. Number one, of course, is the environment. Each step in tea production is more important than the subsequent step. So the further you go towards where the tea came from, the more important that will have on the quality of the tea. Each step back, in other words, back in time, is more determinant to the final quality of the tea than the one that comes after. Part of the reason why is because each step will determine what happens next. So this step will determine how this step is done, which will determine how this step is done. So all the previous steps will determine why this step is done, and all the previous steps will determine why this step is done and how it's done. So understanding the general principles that go into a tea's production, oolong tea or any other kind of tea, is only a basic formula, a beginning formula. Farmers and master producers aren't actually using a formula when they're creating their art. They're involved in the art, they're present with it. It's there. That's true of any art. Just like if I give you brewing instructions and I give you a general step-by-step list of procedures to make Gong Fu tea, that's not really what's going on in my mind or heart when I'm brewing. There's subtle adaptations happening for every single tea. So in tea production, the previous step is always more important. So in other words, the most important step, of course, always is nature herself, is the terroir, the climate, the soil, the place where the tea is grown, the altitude, the nutrients in the soil, all of that. That will determine the altitude and place and location and mountain will determine what varietal the farmer chooses to plant. And that, combined with the weather, will determine when the tea is harvested and how it's harvested. And then when and how it's harvested will determine how it's withered, in the case of oolong tea. And then how it's withered will determine when and how it is fired and the withering is arrested in the sachin. So you can see each step, all the previous steps are informing the next step. And that's how tea processing is working. So if you go back, the most important determining factor in the quality of any tea is going to be its terroir, its environment, nature herself, because all of nature works together, cooperates together to produce tea. And that's why organic tea is so important, because when tea is fed by chemical fertilizers and weed killers and pesticides, when those things are used, then the tea is not really a product of its local ecology. It isn't actually feeding off of the mountain and the terroir around it. It isn't actually producing leaves from the nutrients from the earth and from the sun and from the water and all of that, because its food is basically coming from another ecology somewhere else and then being shipped in by humans and fed, you could say, in a manner of speaking, intravenously to the tea. So it's getting its food source from an alternative terroir. So it's not living off of the terroir in which it lives, off of the environment in which it lives. It is receiving nutrients from elsewhere. And that comes in the form of chemical fertilizers or even natural fertilizers shipped in, right? So that means it's not fully a product of its environment. We want the roots to grow down. We want them to drink from the mountain there. We want the insects, right? What relationship the insects have to the tea is very important. They also play a role. Everything in that ecology plays a role. All of that nature, however rich the nature is, however rich the biodiversity is, that will determine how rich the soil is. If the biodiversity is rich, the soil will be rich. The nutrients will be rich. Much of the fertilizer in the soil comes from the death and decay of the biodiversity of the environment. So when the environment is strong and rich and full of nutrients, then the tea, of course, absorbs that, and it's a product of its environment, and it will grow full of that rich environment, and it will come out full. 15 years ago, I made a decision that I would only drink organic tea, and I've been surrounded by tea ever since. There's tons of tea in this center that's sustainably produced. However, that means that sometimes certain genres of tea aren't as accessible to me as others. So even though I'm surrounded by tons of beautiful teas to drink, I can't always choose, hey, today I really want this specific tea, a Longjing green tea. Because Chinese green teas, for example, happen to be a genre of tea that there aren't as many organic examples of. And yes, they do come, and yes, there are beautiful farmers doing great things, but they're more rare in my life because I live in Taiwan, and there's very strict import laws between China and Taiwan. And also, those teas are a little bit more rare and difficult to find because that's a genre that's more geared toward the mainstream. And so the farmers that produce that tea are often producing with quantity in mind. They're often producing because they want volume, they want to earn money. So it's not a genre that is as conducive to sustainable farming. The same with high mountain oolong. Actually, it's a lot of the lower elevations that have switched to sustainable organic farming because they've had to compete. Because in the mainstream, this idea was promoted by tea vendors, which is actually not true, but anyway, it has a teeny bit of merit, and they caught on it and used it to sell tea, which is the idea that elevation is commensurate with quality, so that the higher the tea is grown in Taiwan, the better it is. There's a little bit of truth in that. There is some reasons for that, but for the most part, that's absolutely not completely true. Half of quality in oolong tea is also in the processing, and also there's great places to grow tea that are a little bit lower, and so really you got to look at the place. But anyway, in the mainstream market, this idea that the higher the elevation the tea, the better the quality, took on. And that meant that lower elevation regions like Dongding and Lugu and like Mingjian, where Mr. Xie is, and other places, they really lost their market. They were hit hard by this. And because they're so much lower, they couldn't compete. And so in more recent times, those regions, one of the ways that they've found a way back into the market, they found a niche, is to produce sustainable organic tea, and in that way set themselves apart. So finding a high mountain oolong tea that's grown sustainably and organically is really, really difficult. And this month we found a sustainable organic tea from Lisan. So a tea from Lisan, from such a high elevation, grown in a really awesome biodiverse farm that's really great, is a rare, rare find indeed. And that's the first thing that makes nostalgia such an amazing tea. The second really amazing feature of nostalgia is that it's traditionally processed. Traditional processing in oolong tea is becoming rarer and rarer, especially in Taiwan. And it's extremely rare within high mountain oolong. It's very rare. So finding a traditionally processed high mountain oolong, even finding someone willing to make you a traditionally processed oolong, is really rare. We got really lucky because a friend of ours in Taipei was holding a tea event, and it was all about traditional processing. It was a gathering, and there was a forum where some experts were going to talk, and the whole event was geared around traditional processing, and they were going to make some Lisan tea, also to have a small packet as a gift for all the participants who came to the event. And so our tea kind of piggybacked and was processed along with that tea and became traditionally processed tea. It even got packaged the same as theirs in a traditional packaging that they made out of paper, which we showed you in the magazine. That's actually the packaging that was used for that event to commemorate traditional tea, which was packaged in paper. But finding someone willing to process high mountain oolong in a traditional way is very rare these days. To understand this, you have to understand a little bit of history and a little bit of the history of tea, because the history of tea in Taiwan through the 70s and the 80s actually impacted oolong globally. It impacted oolong tea in China as well. It spread over there and changed the whole oolong market. So what the events that happened in Taiwan over the course of 20, 30 years changed the oolong market in both Taiwan and China, and from there to all the oolong lovers all over the world. There are less affected areas like Wuyi, for example, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So in the 1970s, Taiwan had an economic boom. The quality of life went up. When I was a kid, everything was made in Taiwan the way that it's made in China today. So there's a lot of industry and factories here in Taiwan exporting to the United States. And the quality of life went up in Taiwan, which then with the quality of life, culture came. As Song Huizong, the emperor, spoke about in April, when the society is stable economically and safe relatively, then culture booms, right? Remember in the beginning of his treatise on tea, he's talking, because he's the emperor, so he's talking about how there's more study into tea and other arts because the country is stable. And so in the same way, the stability in Taiwan created a boom in culture, and the tea industry also had a huge boom. Now, the problem with traditional oolong is that it's not really conducive to a large mainstream boom. It's not conducive to mainstream production in a lot of ways. First of all, the processing itself requires a tremendous amount of skill. Oolong tea, the quality of oolong tea is at least half in the trees, half in the terroir, and half in the processing. The skill required to process tea is very, very deep. Sometimes sons will spend 20 or 30 years apprenticing with their father before they're given the responsibility of actually taking over a harvest on their own. So it requires a lot of years to develop the skill to process oolong in a traditional way properly. And the margin of error is much more narrow. So the tea that's sorted out will be a lot, if you make mistakes, will be a lot more. You'll lose a lot of tea because there's a narrow margin. When you're producing tea with heavier oxidation and or roast, then the tea that is improperly processed will really not taste nice. And so more tea will be downgraded if you're not doing a really good job. So you need much more precision in your tea processing skills, and that's important. So you need a lot more skill to produce oolong tea in a traditional way. It requires skill that can take time. But in order to have a mainstream boom, that's just not feasible. When you move to large plantations that are producing large quantities of tea, you want to develop machines that can process the tea for you. And you want those machines to have a much more broad margin of error. And you need to be able to train employees to process the tea faster and in larger quantities and with a much wider margin of error. So they started shifting more and more towards lighter oxidation and or roast. Lighter oxidation, lighter roast, greener oolong. Oolong that's closer to green tea. So it's easier to process. You can train employees to do it in a matter of weeks or months. Machines can do it. It's much more feasible to the mainstream and to that production. The second major problem with traditionally processed oolong is that it's difficult to brew. It requires skill to brew. If you put the wrong amount of leaves or the wrong temperature of water, or you steep it too long or too short, it can become sour, for example, very quickly. It is more difficult to brew. It requires more skill to brew. Whereas lightly oxidized tea, this is why green tea is so popular in the mainstream, because lightly oxidized oolong, they were shooting for green tea. It's fragrant, it's easy to brew. You can brew it in a mug, in a tea bag, in any way you want to brew it, and it turns out nice and fragrant. Almost. You can also misbrew it, but it's much easier to brew, and it's more suitable to many different kinds of brewing methods, which is what they were shooting for when they're opening up the mainstream market. It has a problem, though, in that oftentimes this greener, lightly oxidized oolong is in conflict with environmental sustainability, because in order to make the oolong tea greener and less oxidized, it has to be free of bug bites, because when the bugs start biting all the leaves themselves develop holes in them. The hole, where the hole is, you can see red around the hole. The red around the hole is the leaf itself being bruised and or oxidized. So that means that it's going to be more oxidized before it's even picked. So to make those really light teas, you almost need pesticides, right? Which is why they also started moving to higher and higher altitudes. There's less pests there. So you can make that lightly oxidized tea and still be organic. It just requires some work. But in general, on a large scale, it's not as conducive to sustainability. It also ultimately is much more of a cash crop. It generates much more money, because when you start selling the idea of freshness, you give consumers the feeling that they need to consume that tea quicker. So they go through more of it faster, because they have the idea that it's got an expiry date, that they need to drink that tea quickly, or it's not going to be fresh and green and delicious like it was when they bought it. So people have a need to consume more tea. This also opens up the industry to all other kinds of industries. Packaging, vacuum sealing, aluminum foil sealing, and all of that, all of the machines used to produce those aluminum foil bags, and all the various kinds of packaging, and the vacuum sealers, and all that kind of packaging came, right? Traditional oolong, as we talked about earlier, was just wrapped in paper, because it's oxidized and roasted. The longer it sits, the better it's going to be. It's just going to get better and better. So nobody felt the need to like drink it quickly, or a need to have all that environmental waste in all those foil packages, vacuum sealed, and all the machinery that creates all of that. So traditional oolong tea, it didn't matter that the bugs were biting it. Often that processing evolved to suit the fact that the bugs had bitten all the leaves and they were more oxidized. And so you have that kind of more environmental friendliness, sustainability in traditional processing, whereas this mainstream lightly oxidized greener oolong is much more sterile and suitable to machine processed, large quantities, and inorganic, unsustainable production. Also, the fact of the matter is that while I do love a sustainably produced lightly oxidized oolong, this is not a black and white issue. I'm really glad that nowadays we have both kinds of tea. That tea actually is much less rewarding to drink. It's fragrant and it smells like flowers, and it's often beautiful and delicate in that way, but it lacks all the rich depth and character and body of traditionally processed tea, especially teas that were back in the day hand processed, where every tea was different. Nowadays, even the traditionally processed teas are made with machines, and so there's so much less character in the teas. So character is a big part of why I love traditional processing. They're different. Each one is different and unique and special, especially back in the day when they were hand processed. Every tea that you got, every batch of tea that you get would be different. Nowadays, there are still some few farmers hand processing tea. We have brothers in Wui that are doing that. And every year, every batch that you get, it's just so different. It's like meeting new people that are interesting, and instead of like, a lot of companies selling us products that they think everybody wants exactly the same. And in certain industries, that's a good thing, that standard and everything being produced the same. But I think tea, a big part of it is those characters, the story, the nuances, the depth, the richness. So nostalgia is a traditionally processed tea, which means it's rich and deep and dark. It has a higher roast and oxidation than other oolongs that are being produced today, especially high mountain oolongs. This is very, very oxidized and roasted for a high mountain oolong. And it's full of character and depth and nuance from cup to cup. It's one of the best Taiwanese oolongs I've ever had. So that's the second reason why nostalgia is such an amazing tea. First, because of the terroir where it comes from, high mountain and yet also sustainable with biodiversity. to traditional processing, which means more oxidation, more roast, more depth, more character, more interesting nuances from cup to cup. The third reason why nostalgia is so amazing has to do with the roast of the tea. Now, roasting is one of the most important steps. If it's overdone, you taste the roast. They say in oolong processing that each stage should enhance the tea but leave no trace of itself. So in other words, if you taste the firing, the sachin, then that wasn't a good sachin. It should do its job and leave no trace of itself. So if you're tasting the roast was overdone. That's often done to hide defects in the tea. So oftentimes down-sorted teas are roasted heavily so that you can cover up the fact that they were down-sorted. So too heavy of a roast, you'll get that roast flavor. Too light, it doesn't bring out the richness, the nuttiness, the fruitiness in the tea. So the roast has to be just right. Traditionally, roasting wasn't done by farmers in Taiwan and in many other oolong producing regions in China as well. Traditionally, it was shop owners actually who were master roasters. Many of you will remember the article that we wrote about Master Lu in Inga in January of 2015, I believe. And we talked about how he roasts, still even today, roasts all the tea in his shop. So back in the day, shop owners roasted all their tea. They would receive mao cha, rough tea. That's a term that we nowadays mostly use to talk about pu'er. Last month's video, Tea of the Month video, we talked about pu'er processing and how mao cha comes to the factory to be finished. Mao cha just means unfinished tea. So oolong also was unfinished. It was mao cha, and it would come from the farms and then be roasted by the shop owners to suit the taste of their customers. Master Lu still does this today. He roasts all of his tea. And so shop owners actually were the master roasters. And just like farmers had secret techniques and traditions of processing tea that they handed down from father to son, tea shop owners had master roasting techniques that they handed down from father to son, and this roasting became a skill, a gong fu on its own. Really fine tea requires the cooperation of many, many, many disciplines. From ceramicists producing really fine teaware, to farmers growing and producing their tea well, to master roasters roasting it well, to brewers preparing it properly with the proper tradition and methodology of brewing. All of that coming together to make a really fine cup of tea. So traditionally you had these master roasters, often shop owners. And one of the most famous roasters in Taiwan is a man named Mr. Tsai. You can read about him in the magazine. He's very, very renowned from Tainan, from down south. He roasts tea exquisitely. He's been doing it for like 30 years. He opened a tea house back in the day when tea houses were popular in Taiwan. And then as the tea house kind of boom, died down, he's converted that to a shop. But throughout it all, he was roasting all of his own teas like Master Lu. And he's one of the best, most renowned roasters of Taiwan oolong tea in the world. He's amazing, and we've been heckling him and hounding him to roast some tea for us for a long time. He finally agreed, and so that is the third reason why nostalgia is absolutely amazing. It was given a master class roast. This roast is stunning and superb, brought out all of the nuances and fruity, nutty aromas of the tea in a really perfect way. He roasted it immaculately. Having such a stellar tea roaster roast our tea is a really, really rare opportunity. And ordinarily, the teas that he roasts would, of course, be very, very expensive. And most of the teas that he roasts, of course, because he's just a tea roaster, just a shop owner, he doesn't necessarily get access to all of the same kinds of sustainable teas that we get. So some of the teas that he roasts for other people might not be as sustainable. So getting him to roast our tea this month took years to develop the relationship and to finally find the right opportunity to get him to roast a tea for us. So nostalgia is a confluence of these three amazing forces coming together in beautiful tea karmas: a sustainably grown tea from a high elevation from Lisan, amazing terroir, and then traditional processing done with care and time and effort to produce oolong tea as it was done for hundreds of years, and then a masterclass roast by one of the most famous tea roasters in the world. And these three things come together to make this one of the most exquisite teas ever that I've ever tasted as far as Taiwanese oolong goes, and definitely one of the rarest and best teas we've ever sent in Global Tea Hut. A lot of you have emailed us and asked where you can get some nostalgia because it's such an amazing Taiwanese oolong. People want more of it. We understand. But Global Tea Hut's purpose is education. We aren't tea vendors. We aren't here to sell tea. We're here to grow in understanding and awaken harmony through tea by building free centers where people can come and learn from around the world, and by distributing this magazine with tea every month so that you can all learn. That said, we've decided to give away 3 150-gram packets of nostalgia over the course of this month. They're wrapped in the beautiful traditional paper processing, and we're going to give them to the 3 people that we feel have done the most to spread the word about Global Tea Hut, to encourage others to join, to help us to build your future center, Light Meets Life, and to contribute to the current center, Tea Sage Hut. So go out there, spread the word about Global Tea Hut by having tea sessions, by social media, or any other way that you see fit. And at the end of the month, we're going to choose the 3 people that support Global Tea Hut the most and send them 150 grams of this beautiful tea nostalgia. As you learn this month all about all of the history, folklore, processing, and traditions of Taiwanese oolong, and drink this beautiful tea nostalgia, we hope you also remember why it is we're all gathered here to spread awakening through tea and to share community and a mutual love of each other and tea. And remember, love is changing the world, cup by cup.